When it comes to working on wildlife, whether you are doing this as a professional or as an individual trying to make some change, and especially when it comes to conservation, we're often faced by two limitations. Can you guess them? It's time and money. So in today's episode of the Fancy Scientist podcast, I want to share with you some of my tips and reframes that I have around these two issues that have really helped me out. And I know a lot of you out there are currently struggling. In fact, those are two of the biggest things I hear for why people can't get things done. So whether you are aspiring to be a wildlife professional, you're entry level, even if you're deep in a wildlife career, or if you're somebody who volunteers, like my sister has a full-time job, but she wants to do things to help animals. But again, we're always limited by time and money. So what can we do to work around those issues? Today, I am going to empower you with some ideas and get you thinking differently about both time and money so we can get out there, help wildlife, and conserve this planet. When it comes to these two issues, time and money, you're probably telling yourself stories. And in the last two podcast episodes, I've kind of set it up for this episode to dig deeper into the challenges that us dealing with wildlife conservation face. And I talked about some of the helplessness and what we can do. With time and money, the most common thoughts that tend to come up are there's never enough. There's never enough time. There's never enough money. And these are stories that we both learn and that we tell ourselves. And one of the first steps to changing your perspective on both time and money is to really separate the story from the truth. Are these really just stories that we're telling ourselves? We always tell ourselves stories. And are these stories serving us or are they not serving us? For time, let's deal with time first. If you're running out of time, how is that going to help you? If you're constantly thinking you're running out of time, you're running out of time, you're running out of time, how is that going to help you? Well, you might think that, like I used to think, that this thought can kind of kick you in the butt. That you could be like, well, I don't have enough time, so I got to hurry up and do this thing. But the thing that happens is when we feel this way, it often causes stress. And when you're stressed, you can't think as clearly because there's adrenaline and cortisol running in your body, and it just doesn't cause your brain to function as clearly, to think as clearly. So you're not as smart, honestly. You can't think as clearly. So having this sort of stress, anxiety, and pressure that we put on ourselves, is it helping us? We think it helps us because we think that it's forcing us to do things faster. But when we actually do it, what we find is that we make more mistakes, more scattered, we're more frantic, and then we don't get things done. Now, think about yourself in a really calm, relaxed state where you are getting things done. A lot of people call this the flow state or deep work. I love this state when you are into the groove of a project and you're working on it and things are just coming to you. Like when you're deep in writing, when you're deep in thinking about creative projects or data analysis, when you're getting the code, when it's working out for you. And when we're like that, we're usually not the stressed and anxious and scattered way that I was talking about in the beginning. So we think this way of being helps us, but in reality, it doesn't. So this story of being stressed out, being busy all the time, being anxious, it ain't helping us. And then you know what else happens? At least this happens to me. And I know this happens to a lot of people because I talk to a lot of people. And in the episode of the Conservation Career Trap podcast, this is referenced in the article where we get to burnout. We're pushing ourselves so hard, and then we just sort of collapse, and then we end up doing nothing for like weeks on end, or even months on end, or maybe even a year on end because we're so burnt out, or maybe we even leave the career permanently. Like that's what happened to that person, is that they left their job. So we want to avoid this type of thinking. So the first step in managing your time, in feeling like you have an abundance of time, we want to shift from a scarcity mindset. Scarcity mindset is where we think there's never enough. And this, again, happens for both time and money. It can apply to a lot of other things. But we want to shift from the scarcity mindset to an abundance mindset, an abundance of time. And again, we also want to separate the stories that we're telling ourselves, the fiction, from the fact of what's really going on. When I work with my students in a successful wildlife professional, I give them a bonus called Overcoming Overwhelm. And in this bonus, the first thing that we do is, again, separate the story from what is actually going on. So for both money and time, the first step that I recommend that you do is track. So for this next week, I challenge you to track your time. Literally track every waking half hour and sleeping half hour too, but track this in your schedule. I do this every day, and it's not hard. Once you start doing it, you get used to it. You can do it old school way using pen and paper. You can use a spreadsheet. You can use apps. I like to use the app Toggle. And basically, the first week, all I want you to do is to look at how you spend your time and what you are doing with your time. When you track your time, there's a couple of things that happen. First, when you actively track your time, you use your time differently. If you start tracking, like for me, say I start tracking, then I'm going to work on a podcast. Before I did this podcast, I wrote some notes. So say I'm starting to track my time and the timer's going and it says podcast. Then I get a text message or a notification from social media and I go check that. If I'm not on tracked time, I can tell you I'm more likely to check that and look at that and not care as much that I'm on podcast preparation time compared to if I didn't have the timer going off. If I didn't have the timer going off, it's kind of like you're being accountable, you're being responsible for yourself. And of course, it does happen where you're on track time and I find myself in Facebook. I always go to check Facebook, or I always have to post something to Facebook for my group, and I think it will be a quick thing. And then I will get dragged into some wildlife post about people complaining about coyotes or something will grab my attention. And then you can easily go down that tunnel. But the thing about track time is you are more likely to come back from it. So that's one thing that comes from track time. The other thing is that you might not be realizing how you spend your time. A lot of people, like I said, they're caught up in this story of like, I don't have time, I'm always busy. But when you actually look at your time, when you actually analyze it by the end of the week, how much time were you spending on things that you didn't really want to spend time on? Now, don't get me wrong. We all need time for breaks. We all need time to give our brains a rest, for play, for enjoyment. And that can be social media. It can be Netflix. But are you using your time intentionally? Are you intentionally going on social media and really enjoying it? Or are you just so exhausted, your brain just needs a break, that your brain goes through that scrolling? Or also, is your brain addicted to it? These social media apps are designed to draw us in. They look at brain research, they look at like gambling research and what makes gambling addictive, like the slot machines, and a lot of these apps are built off of that same structure. So use your time with intention, and after a week of tracking time, really assess what is your actual time situation. Does it match up the story that is in your head? Now, say the story in your head that you're super busy, that you don't have enough time. When you track your time, say you realize that that's true. Well, there's several things that you can do about it. And the big thing is really that assessment. And that comes with prioritization and being responsible for yourself. Are you spending the time on the things that are most important, or are you getting caught up in the details? And this is true not just for the things that we might consider wasting time, but when you're working on your projects. I can't tell you in graduate school how many times I was probably working on things that I didn't really need to be working on, that I was part of groups that I didn't really need to be working on. Now, part of that was that I didn't really know what was important. And that's why I do what I do now. That's why I run the Successful Wildlife Professional, so that I can teach my students what is important, what are the big rocks in moving things forward. And I'll explain what a big rock is in a minute. But you want to work on those things that are going to have the biggest impact in your career or the result that you want. So if you're in your career and you are working on a project or a certain agenda, or you want to get something passed, like, who are the key players that you can focus on that will help that result go through, that will help that project go through? What is the publication that you can get done that will further your career? I want you to think about things like that, and not as much those little filler things that don't matter as much. And with that also comes the power to say no. A lot of us don't know how to say no, don't want to say no. And I have a whole podcast about saying yes to yourself and saying no to the other things that don't matter. So what do I mean by big rocks? Let's use this analogy. This is an analogy I love. You have a jar, and then you have rocks, you have sediment, you have sand. Okay, so let me start over. You have an empty jar, and then you have other jars, one full of big rocks, one full of pebbles, and one full of sand. And this, so first of all, I will describe this. This is a classic analogy. And then at the end, I will add something that I can't remember where I heard it from, but I thought it was funny. So also imagine there's a can of beer too, or a bottle of beer. So if you were to pour in the sand, the smaller pebbles, and then the big rocks, it wouldn't all fit into the jar, and the beer wouldn't fit into the jar. But if you put the big rocks in first, and then the small rocks, they will go in between the spaces of the large rocks. And then when you pour in the sand will go in between even those smaller spaces. And then you can also add the beer and fit it all in. Now, what does this represent? So the big rocks, those are the big things in life that are really going to give you what you want. They are going to move you in the direction of getting the thing that you want to accomplish, whether that is a professional goal, a personal goal, whether that has something to do with a conservation agenda or initiative that you are trying to pass, a research project. What are the big rocks that are going to make the big difference? And then the smaller rocks are the smaller pebbles, those are the ones that are not as important, but still have a role. Same thing with the sand. And then the beer, I think is funny. I normally heard this example with just the rocks and the sand and the pebbles, but then I heard it once with beer. And the beer is supposed to represent fun in life. You got to have fun in life too. So you also want to add that to your jar. And this allows you then to get things done. So this is what we do in the Overcoming Overwhelm Workshop, is we determine what those big rocks are, what the smaller rocks are, what the fun things are, because you don't want your schedule to just be filled up with work, because like we talked about, we'll get burnt out if we do that. So you want to have the joy in your life. You want to have the fun things. You want to have the rest. I remember working with this one coach, and I told her that the problem with my schedule was that I would fall asleep because I would get tired. I would fall asleep during the day and I would take a nap. And I was like, I don't know what to do because I can't get my schedule done that I'm following. And then you block these periods of time, but I would fall asleep and this would like delay my whole schedule. And she's like, well, that's an easy fix. You just schedule in naps. So I started doing that, scheduling in rest time. So are you running your schedule, or is your schedule running you? And these are some questions to ask yourself. And are you really focusing on the big rocks, or are you focusing on the small rocks and the sand? Another thing is, when you create a schedule, when you block off time, you're putting a cap on things. One of the things I really loved doing when I was working on research, especially as an earlier graduate student, is doing poster presentations and presentations in general, because I loved the artistic aspect of it. I loved creating the posters, designing it. But as I grew in my professional career, I realized that I was spending too much time on it. And in fact, I remember this one conversation with my PhD advisor at the time where she was giving a talk, I think like the next day or something. And she's like, I haven't started it yet. Or it was like 2 days away, something like that. And it blew my mind. I was like, oh my God, I can't believe that you're doing that. But when you get older in your career, you realize there's things that are so much more important than talks. Depending on the talk, of course, you also get better at it. So it gets easier to give talks, and you do have material that you can work with. So usually you have to tweak your talks. But still, I've been in this situation where I've had to give a talk and I can do a talk last minute. I can put it together. And when you have those last minute things, now I intentionally do it last minute. Like with the posters, I actually changed my strategy to working on them last minute because I purposely didn't want to get sucked in to doing the posters, say like 2 weeks in advance, because then I would spend more and more time on it. But I knew if I started it, let's say a day before I was going to present it to lab meeting to get feedback, then I would spend maybe like a couple of hours on it and it would be capped and then I would be done at it. I wouldn't be going back and forth tweaking it. So I put a lid on it. I put a solid frame on it to cap it and then work on the other more important things. Another great thing about creating your schedule for the week and putting time blocks on things is that it gives you a period to think about things and then not overthink them later because your decisions are made. Does this sound like you? Like, do you go to the office or your workspace and you're looking at a big list of things to do and you're going through and deciding which ones you should work on? And if you're doing that on a daily basis, you're giving so much energy to that decision, to creating that schedule on a daily basis where if you condense it and do it all at once, and then when you go to the office, when you go to your place of work and get started, you just go. You know what to start off with. That's what I do. I used to do the former, now I do the latter, and that saves me so much time. And in those decisions, you're probably overthinking. You're probably second guessing yourself. You're probably doubting yourself. I did a Facebook Live a couple of weeks ago on overthinking. When you do this, this is also a waste of time. So make decisions, make them quick, and follow through. That is a huge, huge time saver. We all have the same amount of time. And it's really important, like I mentioned in the podcast from last time, to look for examples of people who are doing the things that we want or have the things that we have. So just because you're a scientist, it doesn't mean you lack time. I remember when I was in graduate school, I never wanted to become a professor because I heard that professors have no time. They're working all the time because they need to get grants, they need to get publications so that they can get tenure. But then I came across this article, it became kind of famous, and it was called something like the 7-year postdoc. I will link it into the show notes if I can find it. And what this person did is they had a assistant professorship, and it takes about 7 years to get to your tenure. And instead of being freaked out by the possibility of not getting tenure after 7 years, I think it was that she decided to treat it like a 7-year postdoc because we don't get freaked out by the idea of postdocs. I was in a postdoc and it was great. It was one of the best jobs I ever worked. I did publish, I had a great work environment, but there was no deadline. There was no I have to do X before I finish. So although she did have to do things to meet tenure, she wasn't ignoring those things. But if it didn't work out, she was treating it like, okay, well, I had a 7-year postdoc because if you don't get tenure, then you don't get to move on to professor or associate professor. So that was her thinking, and it was effective, and it really helped her move through and do the work instead of being stressed out all the time by the fact that tenure was hovering over her. The Science also ran an article about working parents who were making it work for them. I think it was for working moms. And if you listen to the Liz Cayley's episode, she's also a working mom at the Nature Conservancy. And although kids, they definitely take up time, but the thing about having more things scheduled, even if you don't have kids, is that can force us to really be intentional with our time because we're limited by our time. And that's what the Science article was saying. Because they were so limited with their time, they were really intentional. And when they worked, they worked. I remember in graduate school, we had a lab mate. Once he had a son, he was really diligent about his time. And he would get in really early. I think he would get in at like 6 or 7 in the morning, but he would leave by 3. And when he was done, he was done. He put in his hours and he was done. He was with his family when he went home. So again, just because you want to be successful, it doesn't mean you need to devote all of your time to this one thing. It's about being intentional, and it's about being effective with the time that you do have and not spending time doing other things when you're supposed to be working on this one thing. There's also a lot of research. I read the book Scrum. It's a book about working together in businesses. And they talk about studies where people were given 4-day work weeks instead of 5-day work weeks. And this didn't mean they had to work 4 10-hour days, just 4 days instead of 5 days. And people got just as much, even more done during that time period. So it's not about scarcity of time. It's about how you think about your time and how you use it. Okay, let's now switch gears and talk about money. Even though it's a different topic, the answers, the solutions are similar. When you start thinking about money, what are the stories that you're telling yourself about money? And you can write them down and go through and evaluate, like, are these actually true or not? But you're going to want to start tracking and using data as well. I also have a bonus on money that I have given in the past to students working with a successful wildlife professional. It's based on my own experiences working with finances. My dad grew up from a very poor background. His dad died when he was 55, I believe. So my dad kind of took the head of the household role in helping my grandma out. He had 3 younger brothers. He was the oldest, around 18 when that happened. And he remembers that his mother was a waitress and would come home and they would count the tips at night. And that was like solidified in his mind. So he never wanted to be poor. He always wanted to have enough money. He eventually took over as a business owner at a store that he started off working at. And he became financially well off, not necessarily because he made tons of money, but because he invested his money well. When I say invest well, I don't mean you're super savvy on the stock market, buy, sell, trade. It's about long-term investing, and it's about compounding effects. And this is what I talk about in my money bonus. It's also based on the book, I Will Teach You to Get Rich by Ramit Sethi. I'll put links in the show notes. This is a fantastic book. I don't love the title because I feel like people will get the wrong impression from it, but it's really about, you don't have to make a lot of money. It is about how you use your money. And it's also about starting with the tracking. So I recommend people start by tracking every single expense that they have, every debt that they owe, every expense that they have. And when it comes to the strategies of paying down your and making your budget, there are different ways to think about it. And there's some different strategies to take. But what it boils down to is spending money and enjoying spending money on the things that you truly enjoy, but then cutting costs where you don't care that much. You can scrutinize those costs or ferociously cut those costs, but we shouldn't feel bad about spending money on the things that we enjoy. So many of us mindlessly spend money. And when you track, just like when it comes to time, you become super aware of the things that you're spending money on. When you spend the money, then you have second thoughts. Do I really want to eat out tonight? Do I really want to get takeout food? I never get takeout food. Because it is not only not eco-friendly, I don't like all the plastic containers, but also it's expensive. If I'm going to spend the amount of money to go out to eat, then I might as well enjoy the restaurant. With DoorDash, you get all the fees and everything. It ends up being expensive. But so many people eat out and take out, they go out to eat. If you like doing those things, that's fine, but make sure you're doing it with intention and that you can afford it. When it comes to saving money for your future, being rich, what Ramit is talking about is that long-term richness. So saving money for the future so that when you retire, you are wealthy. And that is what I have learned to do. When I was in graduate school, I was still putting money aside in my IRAs. And that's something that I will never touch. I won't look at that until I am at least 65, maybe even older, because honestly, I love working so much. I don't want to retire. But I have never had a 401k until I worked at the museum. And then that was it. I had a 401k for about like 7 years. So I don't have a traditional career like most people. Now I pay for my own health insurance. So again, what are the stories that you're telling yourself? How does your reality match the stories that you tell yourself? Do you really have no money? Or is that you're spending money on things that really don't give you that much pleasure, enjoy, satisfaction, and you're just getting like too caught up in life and not paying attention? So start tracking. And then what if your situation actually does match your story? What if you really do have scarcity? You don't have enough money. Okay, what can you do about it? I have this book, 22 Ways to Earn Money Now. I will include it in the show notes. It's like a little ebook with different ways that you can make money. So are there ways that you can make money in the meantime until you secure your wildlife dream job? Now, these are not glamorous things. There are things like Uber, like DoorDash, like Rover. There's online virtual assistant work. But there's also like some fun things that, did you know that you can get paid to do reviews of certain products? Actually, I learned this here where I live. I joined this newcomers group and one of my friends works for those organizations. And she's like, yeah, we're always looking for people. So that's in the ebook as well. So are there ways that you can just earn money so that you can do things like invest in your retirement account so that you're not feeling poor, that you feel like you have a cushion later on in life? And I get it. Times are tough now. We definitely see the increases in price. Things are happening. You know, I see it. I have 4 animals and oh my gosh, the vet bills, it seems like they're just going up and up and up. But again, using this attitude of like, what can I do? Where do I have my power? I worked with a coach who ran a business. She was running a 6-figure business. She was paid well, but she still wanted to have extra income for things. So she did Rover. She took in dogs. They were just small dogs that her kids would play with. She was a single mom. She's an immigrant from another country. And she would take in dogs for like a week at a time and make $1,000. My one friend who is not in the wildlife field, she was worried that she wasn't going to get child support from her ex-husband. But she knew that was a possibility, that he lost his job. And she was worried that he wouldn't give her that money, but she didn't want to deprive herself and her girls. She's also a single mom. She didn't want to deprive her girls of anything. So she signed up for DoorDash. And he ended up being able to give her the money, but she was ready. She was ready out there to make that commitment to do it. These aren't long-term things. You don't have to do this forever in your life. This is about what can you do right now to help your situation. So these are actions that are more pointed towards maybe entry-level people or people who are in between jobs. And then also, if you're a struggling wildlife biologist, you're somebody who is applying for jobs and you're not able to get a job. I talk to people who are working just like whatever job they can get. Like some people work at fast food or barista. Can you get a better job that pays you well in the meantime? Can you work for like a medical company doing lab work, doing even like reception work or something like that and get paid better in the meantime so that you can set up for your wildlife career better and maybe invest in some things that can help you get to your better wildlife career? Like, what are the stories in your head that are telling you that you can't do things? My friend, she's a full professional. She works in the medical field. She signed up for DoorDash. She didn't let her ego get in the way and be like, oh, I'm a medical professional. I work in this field. I help these people. She did not let that stop her. Even I was talking to my therapist, and she mentioned that she looked into doing tutoring to get extra money. So again, that's somebody with a full-time job, a full-time career that they chose, that they love, but they didn't let that mindset get in their way. So what are the stories in your head that you are letting get in your way? If you work for an organization or if you're a volunteer and you want to bring money to a conservation topic, say you're fundraising, say you work for a rehab place and you want to raise money to save an individual animal or something like that. I see campaigns like that all the time. Are you just doing things a normal way, or are you thinking creatively? I went to the Society for Conservation Biology conference years ago, and they talked about using GoFundMe and other crowdfunding platforms to raise money. So are you sticking to the more traditional standard of just applying for grants, or are you thinking in more creative ways? Or are you sticking to the just like traditional ways to do things for science? Are you just like sticking traditionally to writing grants and hoping that grants come through? Or are you thinking about doing things creatively, like fundraising through social media? On Instagram and Facebook, you can just start your own, you can just like have fundraisers. So are you doing it in a more creative way? Or again, are those stories limiting you in your head about what you can and you can't do? Thank you so much for tuning in to the Fancy Scientist podcast. Make sure that you subscribe, turn notifications on so that you don't miss any episodes. If you love this episode, or if you know somebody out there who's struggling with time or money, please share, because that's what happened to me. I listened to podcast episodes and I bought books and courses that helped me out. But honestly, it all started with podcasts. Yeah, that's pretty much how I got all of these tips is I found really helpful podcasts that really changed my mindset. So please share this video. I would also love to hear back from you. Spotify is now letting people comment, and I'm starting things where I ask questions and ask polls. So I would love to know what you think about this episode. You can comment on Spotify, also on my social media. I really love to hear back from you guys. It helps me know what kind of content to create. And I truly believe that things are possible for you guys. Do not let yourself be restricted in this little box. Whether you are working on your own career, whether you are in a job and you are trying to make something happen, you're trying to fundraise that money, you're trying to pass some legislation, you are trying to make a project happen, whatever it is, look at the stories that you're telling yourselves and choose a new story. Choose a story that works in your favor and gets you the results that you want. Thank you so much for listening. Be kind to each other, be kind to animals always, and have a great day. Bye.